Hi, and welcome to week 7 of vry102 on FXPHD. I'm Darius Derek Shawnee. I'll be your driver for today. Last week we covered the V-Ray Fast SSS2 shader, and we made a little toy alien look all rubbery and used some maps to control the SSS. This week we're going to get a little bit more detailed and talk about look developing this alien model that was designed and modeled by Martin Punchev from cgzen.com. Thank you, Martin, for providing this alien. He also did a texture paint in ZBrush, I believe, on the alien as well. So we have a basic diffuse color as well as a model, obviously. We have two parts of the eye. We have a clear coat on the eye as well as the eyeball itself. But otherwise, it's a pretty simple layout. 3 pieces of geometry, the eyes, the clear coats, and the bust itself all grouped together. And we're going to look dev it today using V-Ray 3.0's new skin material, which you'll find right here. Now, let's not put the cart before the horse yet. Let's take a look at how we're setting up. Now, the way I like to approach my look dev on things like this is to go light by light. I've got 3 lights set up, and my environment is being overridden with a reflection, and that's what we're seeing here. This is not on a dome light. I only have 3 rectangles, a fill coming in from the front angle. We've got a key that's coming in from a slightly backside, and we have a large rim coming in from the bust's right-hand backside. And like I said, we're overriding our environment with an HDR that you can see here. And I've got the sun beating down on our little alien, and that'll be useful for reflections, especially when we start getting into developing the look on the eyes, which we'll do with a blend shader. My intention with this look development is to create patches of shell under which we have kind of a soft looking skin around the ears, the eyes, the mouth, the lips, but there'll be a hard shell on top in some of these areas to make this guy look mean on the outside and soft and squishy and cuddly on the inside. Sort of like your host, me. Okay, so let's get started look developing. I have my 3 lights are disabled right now. I have a camera set up here. Now I need to go to Legacy Viewport so I can see a better layout of the texture. If I go to Viewport 2.0, it gets a little muddy and I lose my environment. So I'll stay in Legacy here, and what I would like to do is IPR render this camera so I can get a good feel for how my lights are doing. Now it's being lit by V-Ray default lights right now. So as soon as I enable one of my lights, I'll begin seeing how my lights start stacking up. This way I get a much better sense of how my lighting's going to respond, especially with skin, because you want, some decent backlighting to give you some subsurfacey effects. So I'm going to start with my rim light, and I've got it pretty much positioned the way I like to have it. And I'll disable my rim, and we'll go to my key light now and turn that guy on. These are all named in the outliner, so you can follow along pretty easily on which is which. I'm in Alien Bust V01. My name's a little different because I'm doing some stuff in my version, but you'll be loading up Alien Bust V01. And you'll have V-Ray material set up for the alien with these textures, and all 3 of your lights will be off. So you'll have to enable them and kind of move it around until you get a look that you're happy with. And I'm going to accentuate sort of that backlighting a little bit more to make sure we kick up some of these skin areas. And we'll be happy with that key. And here's my fill. Now I'm putting a little bit of color on these guys as well. Let's go a little bit brighter on this light and get a little bit more frontal. And we'll probably increase the size a little bit to get a little more widespread illumination. And again, my environment is not casting any sort of light. It's just these three guys, my key fill rim. Now, I'm happy with this. I'm going to enable all my lights all at once so I can see the full lighting. And I'll be look deving on this sort of dramatic light. I don't have GI turned on. This is all direct light. We can deal with GI a little bit later once we get the basis for our character's look. Here's our current shader layout. Again, we just have a single JPEG that gives us our basic diffuse color. We're going to go into Photoshop with this and hammer out a bunch of subdermal maps and things like that. We've got a couple of glossy maps as well. Well, let's take a look at the mechanics of our skin shader. So if I create my skin material, and I'll just go ahead and willy-nilly apply it, you'll see an immediate response where we get our mean-looking alien suddenly turns into a fleshy model. Now, as we mentioned in last week's class, scale is terribly important. And I've measured out basically the scale of our alien's forehead is approximately 27 centimeters from back to front, which is about 10 or so inches. So it's a pretty big head. My own head is about 7 inches back to front. So this guy's, kind of monstrous, but not horribly so. A lot of what you set up in the skin shader is based on radius and thickness, and getting scale is pretty important. If we take our scale value and I suddenly give him scale of 5, that essentially will make him feel much more translucent, and you can see that a lot of our medium and deep color is starting to go through, overtaking our shallow color. Now, this is where the skin material differs from the fast SSS. Our fast SSS that you can see here gave us diffuse color and diffuse amount, subsurface and scatter color, and then one control for the scatter radius. Not a terribly intuitive interface. The skin material tries to address that by giving you better and more intuitive controls. And those are basically the shallow, the medium, and the deep color. The radius numbers each control these three components, and you should always have your shallow radius be less than your medium radius, and have your medium radius be less than your deep radius. It's been recommended that the shallow radius shouldn't go above 0.1. Matter of fact, using small numbers for this is generally best. 0.03 to about 0.1 is the skinny from the folks at Chaos. Thanks to Rusco for his suggestion. The medium radius obviously will have to be higher than the shallow and lower than the deep radius. Keep that in mind. Otherwise, you're going to get some strange effects going on in your renders. Furthermore, and we'll get to this a little bit later, there are two reflection controls, secondary and primary, for the shine of the skin. And this is really nice as it avoids frequent use of the blend material to add and add and add on top of the skin. So we're going to have a lot of control with these two reflections. And then we've got multiple scattering, which is already set to ray traced, which is fantastic. And lastly, in our quick little overview here, at the very top, you've got a max SSS and a max reflection amount that allows you to control the overall SSS and the overall reflection from those controls in the shader. Now, we're going to reset our scale back to 1 because the scale of our model is pretty accurate to real-world units. Your mileage may vary depending on how your units are set up, but when you open Alien Bust V01, everything should be set up and you should get this exact result when you put a default skin material on your object. Now, as you may recall from last week's class, whatever we put into the diffuse color on the fast SSS2, if we increased our diffuse amount all the way up to 1, it gave us basically a regular V-Ray material. It's different with the skin material. Here we have a diffuse color of gray, but there's still some scattering going on. It doesn't completely replace and make this into a gray V-Ray material like you would expect with the fast SSS2. So the diffuse amount does play a role, but not in the same way as fast SSS. That's important to note if you're used to that shader already. Instead, if you want to basically turn this back into a regular V-Ray material, you're going to be turning down the max SSS amount, and that'll give you pure diffuse based on whatever color you've got going on here. This is all reflections now because our diffuse is essentially black, but it's the max SSS amount that will dictate how much of the subsurface comes through under the diffuse color. With the alien model from last week, we were able to paint features directly onto our soft rubber of that model by just using a diffuse amount map and a diffuse color map. Here we're going to have to think a little bit differently. Now, to get the most mileage and control out of my look dev, I'm going to go to my camera and I'm going to enable V-Ray physical camera. So I have some exposure controls. We'll turn it on and we'll get pretty dark. I'm going to set my f-stop to 2.8 and my shutter speed to 40, and that'll give us a pretty good illumination. This way I'll be able to do some neat camera stuff alongside the actual material stuff. I'm not going to do any of that yet, but I do want to be looking at it as if I've got the physical camera set up. So again, that's a f-stop of 2.8 with a shutter speed of 40. Now back to our skin shader. We're going to use the skin, and we'll be wanting to get the artist's textures. And primarily, because the fast SSS2 differs from the skin will use a diffuse component after all. And that brings us to Photoshop. Here is what Martin has painted for the alien. And what I've done is I've created a series of folders with some layer adjustments and some masking. And let's go through how each of these is being made. I made a quick skin diffuse adjustment layer set with a little bit of a hue, bringing up some saturation and some leveling to get some contrast. You can also do this very easily in Nuke. So if I can turn on the map that I want to output and then just go to Save As and save out my JPEG version for whatever map it is that I'm creating. I've got one for diffuse amount we can take a look at, where I'm bringing in a much stronger diffuse area in some of these parts where I feel it's necessary to show off a tougher shell than it is softer skin. So let me take you through the step-by-step. We start with leveling this out so we can get a very high contrast. Now I'm protecting the ears because I want to do something slightly different with the ears. And here's what you can see. With the ears, I wanted to keep these parts, that fleshy part of the ear, protected so it doesn't end up getting a more solid diffuse. Desaturate and then level again to bring up these areas and get diffuse going in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more layer straight on where I'm going to create a little bit of a black paint on top of the ears to further bring down their diffuse contributions, because I do want the ears to be pretty fleshy. And again, the diffuse contribution for the skin is a little bit different than the fast SSS2. So this ends up being my diffuse amount. And since I've made an adjustment to the ear, I'm going to save as JPEG. And this will be my diffuse amount 03. Now, these JPEG maps you'll have access to when you download this, but it's important to see how these are generated so you can make your own based on your own designs. Now, I've got 3 layers called subdermal. I've got subdermal deep, medium, and shallow, which all correspond to the deep, medium, and shallow colors that we'll be using for the scattering. So let's take a look at the shallow. This gives us a slightly pinkified version of the existing coloration for our character. We can have it with or without that little extra boost of contrast from the diffuse color. And the settings are pretty simple. We've got basically a hue coloration that you can see here. I'm colorizing with a bit of a pinkish hue. Hue's at 0, saturation's at 37, and I brought up the lightness by +8. And then when we go into the levels, we're creating a little bit more contrast by squeezing our histogram down a little bit to further that look. And that is currently the shallow color for the subdermal. Now, we'll be going back and forth and adjusting all of these maps as we light and render and see that feedback happening. So let's move on. I'll turn off the shallow and I'll go on to our medium. Now, I've got 2 different mediums set up. I made a medium originally with very, very nasty green, which makes him look much more like an alien. We'll come back to this one at some point. But our medium pink version is much more toned down, even more toned down than our shallow. That gives us a very slight pink hue. And again, same thing as before. We have a slight color rise on the hue with a high saturation and a high lightness value, and then a pretty gentle leveling on top of that. But this is at a very low opacity level. This is at an 11% to give a slight pinkish hue, because this will end up being primarily the coloration we'll get when we put it on the skin material. And then the deep, we have a more toned down, kind of purplish, brighter tone. Let's take a look at the levels here. We start with levels that takes a lot of the contrast out, and adding on top of that is a bit of a hue saturation, where I'm pumping up the saturation as well as adjusting the hue into a +135 range to get that sort of orange-red coloration. And the subdermal deep is only sitting 30% opacity on top of the diffuse coloration. Now, if I want to accent my ears a little bit and get them to be more subdermally, I can increase the deep penetration. I've made this as a pretty severe magenta, but this is something that you can add to the ears if you really want to make them look fleshy. We'll get to that. And then lastly, there's a glossiness map that was basically already painted as a spec map by Martin. We can also generate something like this by desaturating and running some levels, but essentially it's already been created by the artist, and I went in and leveled it to get some bright specularity. And I could use this either on the reflection color to inhibit reflection and bring out reflection in the shell areas of the skin, or on the glossy map itself, so that I have much less glossy reflections in the skin, the soft areas, and have a much higher gloss on the shell of our alien. So that, in a nutshell, is how this PSD has been set up. It's all been built on Martin's original painting, and something you can replicate pretty easily with whatever maps that you create for your own. Now, I have all of those Photoshop maps saved out as JPEGs, and you'll also have them. I have a few extra files in my listing here than you will in your source images folder for expediency's sake. We're going to be grabbing our diffuse color, that's diffuse 02 for our alien. We're going to grab what we just wrote out, the alien diffuse amount 03, and this basically reduced the amount of diffuse on the ears, as you just saw. We're also going to bring in some of our subdermals that we can start attaching. We've got our shallow 02. We've got our deep. I've got a couple of different options for deep. We've got the deep 02 that we just looked at with the ears and then without the ears. And we're going to start with deep C 02. Bring that one in. And we have our shallow 02. Got shallow. We've got our deep. And let's put the medium in between. We bring in CO2 to see. So we've got our medium here. Now, you can see all of these are named, but it's tough to read the names, so I'm going to just adjust the name so I can see right off the bat if it's shallow, medium, or deep. And there we have it. This will be our primary mats. We also have a normal that was output by our artist Martin, and that'll be available as a JPEG as well. We'll go ahead and just name that normal right there, and we'll be adding this last. Okay, so our diffuse, which is not too different than our medium C, will be going actually on our diffuse color. You'll see a slight coloration only when I start bringing up the diffuse amount. With it all the way down, we'll go back to that pink, but we'll see a little bit of that coloration with the diffuse amount turning up. Now, I have a diffuse amount map that I'm going to add to the diffuse amount that'll allow the diffuse to come through a little bit more in those shell areas. But as you can see, that coloration is not very specific. It's not very deep because most of our coloration is coming from our scatter. So let's take our shallow, which is a pretty hot pink, and we'll add that to our shallow color. And we see we're getting a little bit more, but not a whole lot. The biggest difference you're going to see is when you map the medium color. We'll grab our medium C and put that into our medium color. We're starting to see that coloration coming through. And you'll start noticing a little bit of differentiation between the diffuse portions that we've called out in our diffuse amount versus the much softer skin areas. And he's starting to look pretty fleshy at this point. And finally, let's bring in our deep into the deep color. Grab deep C 02 and pull that in, and you're going to get a generous change as to our alien's coloration coming from the deep as well. Now, with all three of these maps being based on the same artwork, that's when it really starts to shine on through. Now let's go ahead and add our normal map to this. This is output from Martin as well, the designer. And we're going to go down to our bump and normal mapping. Map type will change to a tangent space normal because that's what this is. This is tangent based. And we'll middle mouse button drag that over to map. And we'll start seeing some more surface details that the normals will afford us, and we'll start seeing some nice breakup, some nice wrinkling, and some good skin texture. Now, here's a full non-RT render of our character so far. We have a pretty fleshy look. There's some of that coloration is coming through. This is no coloration whatsoever. It's just the pure pink of the skin. And here is our existing coloration. Not quite what we're looking at here, but this looks a lot more like a creature, like a skin. But we do want to get some more of this shell color to get a kind of an armor look on top of this softer skin. We'll be addressing that with a blend material in the next class. However, I want to do next is to add a little bit more bump to the skin. Now, I already have a normal map feeding into my bump parameter for the shader, but I can add additional bumps by using the V-Ray bump material. And the V-Ray bump material is kind of like blend material. You've got a base, which will be our skin, and we'll be assigning the V-Ray bump material to our object. Now, this is a pure pass-through, but it allows you to layer bump maps or normal maps on top of what is existing. I have an additional map that I generated from Martin's original texture paint work to bring out the cracks in the alien skin. I'm going to be inverting this and using that as a bump map. I could also use it as a displacement, but we'll start with it as a bump. I'll pull it in, and that's called Screen Cracks Leveled 02. Mine's a TIFF, but you'll have a JPEG for download speed's sake. And for the V-Ray bump material, I'm going to add alien extra bump. There we go. And we're going to add our bump to the map. And I'll be happy with about a quarter bump multiplier. And when we render this out, we'll get that extra skin texture. Now, if I choose, oh, I forgot one thing. Of course, what I need to do in this is go to the color balance. Alpha is luminance, just because that's habit for me. And then invert that. So you've got white on black, and that'll give you this bump map. Now, we could also take this and add it to our object as a displacement. And if you have any questions on displacements, we covered displacements a few classes ago. And here's the difference between the bump map and the displacement map. The displacement map is much cleaner, much nicer, and will hold up to scrutiny at a closer level. However, you've got an added minute of render time, so you're effectively more than doubling your render time from using a bump. We're going to keep this as a bump map for now. Now, because we've already evaluated our scale and we're happy with it, a scale of 1 is pretty good. If we go higher than 1, even with these maps attached to our objects, we're going to start getting more of a gelatinous feel out of the character, much more subsurface deep is coming through, makes him look kind of gelatinous. If we start going below 1, we'll start getting a harder, more V-Ray material look. There is still some scattering going on, but we're getting less of the skin contribution as we had before, particularly around more fleshy areas. Now let's experiment very quickly with changing one of our maps for the more fleshy ear. And that is the subdermal deep B that gives us this crazy purple ear. So if we go to our deep and change it from our C map to our B map to bring up that purple ear. There we go. And when we look at it, we're going to get more of that deep color coming through, which gives us more of that fleshy feel. So in any of the areas that you feel like you want to get more of that flesh color coming through, you can accentuate that in your Photoshop map. For example, we can do that with the nostrils, we can do that with the eyelids, we can do that with the lips. Perhaps not so crazy on the purple, but you can definitely see how we moved away from his regular flesh tone to a much deeper flesh tone. So if we go into that layer, we can certainly adjust the hue to be a little bit less purple and get maybe a little more red out of this guy. Maybe not quite as harsh as before. And we could easily add in some more areas. There we go. We're going to get a little bit more of that fleshy there. We'll see if we can get some of that bags of the eyes will be. And this way we can easily and quickly add that sort of detail. We'll do that to our nostrils as well. Flare those out and accentuate that a little bit to get that flesh. And you can, of course, do this to taste. Save as a new JPEG. And this used to be deep B, so we'll call it deep D. And we'll replace that in Maya once we change this from B to D. And we seem to be getting a kind of a nicer reaction now that we backed off of the purple. And then we've got a little bit of that going on with his lips and a little bit of that going on with his nostrils as well. It gives us more of a flesh feel. Now I'm going to render these and we'll compare the D map with the B map. Here is our original render with our C map that doesn't have the ears or lips and eyes highlighted very much. And here's our map that we just painted. And if you pay close attention to the eye and ear areas, you'll see a subtle difference between the scattering that's coming through. Like the cartilage here with that brighter red map that we just painted in our D map gets that shadow area to fill in with that redder flesh area. You can see that also markedly in the side of the eye, which is receiving a generous amount of that backlight. It will tend to pink out a little bit more. Also with the ear, you can see it saturates to more of a pink in our C map, especially here in the dark area of the lip as well. Now back to our skin material. Here we've got a close-up rendering this region to show you the difference between the radius amounts. This radius is currently set to 0.5, which is the default for this skin, and this is the result you're going to get. When we take our deep radius down closer to our shallow radius, so going from 0.5 down to 0.2, this becomes our result, which gives us a harder skin as less light is coming through. And if we go higher with our radius, closer to where our deep was, at 1.6, this is the render that we're getting, where we're getting a lot more light transluting through our skin. This, of course, is the medium map showing through. So again, we've got our regular 0.5, we have a 0.2, gives us a harder rind look, and 1.6 on the medium. So the higher it goes, the more translucent the skin's going to feel. We're going to keep this at about 0.35 or 0.4. Yeah, let's do 0.4. That gives us something in between here and here. Now let's take a look at the deep scattering attributes, starting with the deep amount. We are currently by default set to 0.4, giving us this render, which is also with the new medium radius that we just set. If we take that number and we go higher with it, here's a deep amount of 1, essentially. 0.4 is here, and 1 is there. So a lot more of that deep color's coming through. It's not as nice as the medium radius coming through. The deep certainly washes out some of these areas, so you don't want to go too crazy on that. But if you go too low, for example, if we take our deep amount and we go to 0.1 instead of 0.4, we start getting it to be a little too hard and not translucent enough. So this is a 0.4 contribution for the deep, and this is a 0.1. The kind of a drastic difference here between those two. It's pretty good at 0.4, so we'll go ahead and leave it at 0.4, and now take a look at the radius numbers. With much lower deep radius, such as 0.6, which is pretty close to our medium radius. You don't want to get lower than the medium radius. But with a 0.6 medium radius, our render hardens out again. It's a little bit more finessed and nuanced than just jamming on the deep amount. This is kind of like a multiplier. The deep radius really fills in and makes these areas more dark, not allowing much light to come transluting through. So our deep radius of 2 is still preferred, but what if we go much higher and go to, let's say, a deep radius of 8? The render starts looking very flat and translucent. So we're just looking at our 2 radius and our 8 radius. And you can see the 8 radius just doesn't look very good. It really bleeds a lot. And wherever it's deep and dark, it's getting replaced with our deep map, which, if you recall, had a lot of that purple. That's where some of that splotching is coming through. So clearly, we're way too high on that radius. So we'll reset our radius back to that default setting of 2. And also keep in mind, obviously, that a lot of this is dependent on the lighting that you've got on. Now let's talk about the reflection and the glossiness. I've adjusted my glossiness map in my Photoshop file to output this brighter image that I'm going to use purely on the glossiness and not the reflection color. We'll go ahead and save this as a JPEG, and we'll call this our alien glossiness 02, and save this out and use that in our skin. And we've got 2 areas that we've got control on our skin. Here's our bump material for the extra bump. There's our skin. We've got primary reflection as well as secondary reflection. And our secondary reflection is currently turned to 0. So here's an IPR render of where we stand right now, primary all the way up to 1 with a 0.6 glossiness, and our secondary at basically 0. When I turn up my secondary reflection amount, we've got a glossier color here So if I go up to about halfway up, notice what happens in these areas. We add a bit of a glistening to the existing reflections. That's because our glossiness on our additive reflection is set pretty high. If we bring that down low, it'll help diffuse across the surface, but in some of the areas where both of these are reflecting, we're going to get a nicer bit of fall off from that reflection. So here we are with just IPR this little area of the temple, and if we have no reflection amount on the secondary versus having a reflection amount on that secondary. So a little bit of difference, a little easier to see if we do a full render of that. Here's a render with our reflection amount turned up to about a 0.7 or so, and we went to 0, and we see a reflection amount of 0 for that secondary. So with a high diffuse, it's giving us a little bit more on the skin than it did before. So that's with the secondary added. Now, if we increase the glossiness of that secondary and have a nice high shine, we're going to start to get a wet look. So we have almost a 0.9 on the glossiness and a 0.7 on the amount of the secondary, giving us more of a kind of a wet look compared to no addition. So that kind of adds directly on top. So you want to play with different glossiness values to get a more complex and rich. So I'm going to reduce my primary diffuse levels, and I'm going to reduce my contribution of the secondary reflection to about half, and its glossiness to about 0.8 to get a fairly good mix with a primary reflection that's going to be more spread and more diffuse, with a little bit of a wettening on top to give us kind of a shinier look. And it's probably a little too glossy. I may want to back off on this a little bit, but this would be a good time to bring in our spec map that we've output. That's our glossiness map, and see how well this will do in mitigating that secondary. So we'll put this on the glossiness first, and that'll control some areas getting much glossier than other areas. So we'll start with a render with that map enabled. And here we see a full render with the glossiness map on the secondary reflection, and the amount was at about a 0.6 or a 0.7, and turning that down to a 0 loses that little bit of shine that we're getting. We're probably a little too dull even with this map on here. We can adjust our primary, because our primary is pretty dull itself at a 0.4. By default, it's at a 0.6, so we'll split the difference and we'll go to about a 0.5. And then on the map itself, what we'll need to do is crush the levels a little bit to get some darker areas, so we can get a few that are dull and then really hit more of a brightness in some other more sweaty or more wet areas. And that's easy to do by just adjusting your levels to create a little bit more darkness, a little bit more contrast in some of these areas without too much difficulty. We can save this out as our JPEG. This is a really good workflow, something that I learned at Digital Domain a while ago when I was doing some look dev for them for some commercial work on the old Fast SSS 2 shading. Although I was using Nuke at the time instead of using Photoshop, although both of these work great. So anyway, we have a new glossiness. I'm just going to go ahead and overwrite our old glossiness with this slightly more contrasty version. In addition, I'm going to turn up the reflection amount on that secondary to go a little bit higher, closer to about a 0.8. And let's make sure we reload, which is a bit more contrasty. And notice that the connection between our glossiness map and our glossiness attribute on the skin is through the alpha channel. So if you want to make any sort of adjustments without going to Photoshop, you have to use alpha gain or alpha offset to darken or brighten the overall contribution that's being led from the map over to our skin shader. So I'm going to go ahead and render this now with our new settings. And when you compare our new render to our old render, this has slightly glossier and more of a contrasty glossy map, which gives us a nicer sort of fall off, which works nicely with the underlying primary reflection. You can also boost these higher if you want to get more glistening maps, or you can use the blend material to add even more areas of high specular if you're looking for. We're seeing a little bit of glistening going on with the lips, and obviously we can paint that even brighter if we want more of that contribution, but we're pretty good with where we are right now. Now, with our existing render, I'm going to go ahead and put it into our history buffer here. You'll notice that we've got that sort of human skin looking thing, which I prefer with the pink, but overall our textures are not that pronounced, and they haven't been throughout. I prefer to go with non-gamma corrected textures at first for skin, so I can get a really good feel for its translucency and a softer skin feeling. So I have not been putting on the texture input nodes that you would otherwise put on all your color. So here we are with our hypershade. Take a look at our network. What I really need to do is go in and add the texture input gamma for all my color. I'm not going to do it for my normals or my grayscale maps, but all of these should have texture input gamma enabled to get the proper color that we expect from our maps. Now when I go in and render this guy out, now with the proper gamma, these textures really pop and you get much closer to the color you're looking for. This guy ended up a little bit darker than what we had before, which is totally cool. And you can see how that color is much stronger. Now, do I advise that you do the same workflows I do? That's up to you. But like I said, I prefer when I'm doing a flesh to start with a lighter color so I can really see the translucency before I get into fixing the gamma on the skin tones. Now, I may start backing off on some of the radii from here, but I'm really liking this at this level. I've also gone in and I've created green, more alien-like versions. Here's the subdermal shallow green.jpg, and we've got a subdermal medium green JPEG, and we've got subdermal deep purple JPEG that we can plug in for a more alien look. And when I sub out those green versions for that pinkier one I have, our render, and we get this guy. So I still prefer the pinkier. However, with the green version, we're a little bit closer to the original artist's conception. Although a little bit greener, I still think that sort of pinky look works better for a vulnerability behind the shell. And what we'll do next week is we'll use this pink version and we'll create a blend shader for the bony shell areas of the alien, as well as clearing up the eyes and rendering out in elements so we can bring it all back together in a Back to Beauty comp using After Effects. Now, pretty much everything we've gone through will work on a value-to-value basis in 3ds Max with the Max files provided. However, stay tuned if you want to see this done quickly in 3ds Max as well to notice any sort of workflow differences between the two softwares. Thanks very much. See you on the forums if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.
Hi, I'm Max.
Now over in 3ds Max, starting with scene alien bust v01.max, we'll see our geometry, same as we have in Maya, where we've got separate clear coat for the corneas, as well as the eyeballs themselves inside there, and the main bust object. We have our 3 lights set up, as you can see here. Same size, position, temperature, and intensity. And we have a basic V-Ray material set up with our bitmap. And I've made our viewport background the vray HDRI node, which is basically also connected to our environment override, just like we had in Maya. Here we are overriding our reflection environment, and I've enabled that environment to be seen in our viewport background as well, so we can judge the positioning of the sun, which is blazing in front of our alien. When you render that first look, we have a pretty dark scene. That's because the difference between the Maya camera and the V-Ray camera is that we have the physical camera already set up in V01. Because with Maya, you can switch a regular Maya camera to a V-Ray physical camera pretty easily. In Max, what I did was go ahead and just create a V-Ray physical camera from the start. So you'll have to adjust the settings as we have done for the exposure. So starting from this point, we'll go into the Modify panel for our V-Ray camera. Our focal length is slightly off from the Maya file, but pretty darn close. Before I go ahead and adjust this, I'm going to go into my active shade and get an RT window rendering out, so I can see how things look as I adjust them. Now, back into our camera. We're going to set our shutter speed to 40, which is what we had before in Maya. And we're also going to change our F number from 8 to 2.8, and that will open up our camera and let a lot more light in, as we can see here in our active shade. Now, our light's a little bit darker than it was in Maya for our fill. I'm going to select my fill light and put the multiplier up to 45. We have our rim light at 120 and our key light at 45 as well. So we'll update our active shade here, and that should give us much more accurate to what we saw in Maya earlier in the video. From here, we're going to create a V-Ray skin material, and let's go ahead and assign it directly to our model, and we'll get that fleshy look as we did earlier. Now, the skin material in Max is the same as it is in Maya. We've got the shallow scattering, medium scattering, and deep scattering in their own rollouts. We have diffuse and diffuse amount, and we have the primary and secondary reflections. All the parameter names match up to the Maya attribute names. So everything we're doing in Maya, you would just do with the attributes here. Even the values that are default match in Max as they do in Maya. For example, our deep amount default is 0.4. It's the same in Max, is the same in Maya. So the shader is word for word the same, and the values will match the same as well. Now, the one thing that may be different between a Max and a Maya scene, as we've talked about before, is dimensions. Dimensions may be different. I've got a tape measure here that basically measures the front to the back at about 10.8 inches, which is in line with what we have in Maya as well. So all of the radius and amount numbers that we've set in Maya will be equivalent in Max. Okay, so let's start bringing in our maps like we did with Maya. We've got our diffuse map here and our subdermal maps. We've got our deep sea here. And let's connect everything with the slate here. We'll do diffuse texture. Here's our deep. Medium. And shallow. And here's our active shade. Now, one thing we did in the Maya version is we changed the deep from the C map to the D map to get a little bit more action out of the scatter for the ears and the lips and the nose. So we can do that easily. And we'll go to the D map. And we can watch the active shade update. And we can see some more of that flesh coming in with that accentuated map. You'll immediately notice one of the first workflow differences between Max and Maya in this case. Our files are already gamma corrected, so we don't need to put any sort of gamma correction on these, and we get the original intended color right off the bat. Now, if I was doing this, I would go in and uncorrect the gamma, so I'd have that lighter, fleshier look. Again, that's a personal preference. You can go either way. As a matter of fact, I would probably suggest that you have the gamma correction coming into your model, but again, my workflow is a little peculiar in that I like to work in uncorrected for flesh tones before I go in and correct for the actual color. Now, for the normal map in 3ds Max, I don't just bring in the normal map itself, this JPEG here, and attach it directly to the bump texture. Instead, what I need to do is create a vry normal map node. Here we go. This will go into my bump texture, and my bitmap will go into the normal map. Now I'm going to delete this. Instead of importing it by dragging it over, I'm going to click the button here to import a bitmap. And on import, I need to override my gamma to 1.0 because I do not want to automatically gamma my normal map. You want that at a 1.0 instead of a 2.2. So alien normal, that's the one I want. Override at 1.0, and here we come in with the override in place. And this will give you your proper normals. You also want to make sure that in your shader that you have bump turned up to 100%. It is by default set to 30, but we need this at 100 for the normals to work properly. And that's it. Again, use the vray normals node, and when you bring in your bitmap, make sure you override it on the import process with a gamma of 1.0. And you can see our normal maps are coming in wonderfully. Now, taking our render one step beyond the normals, if we want to add that skin crack map that we did in the Maya version, we'll first want to bring it in. And when you drag and drop like that, you don't get a chance to override your gamma settings. So you want to go through the bitmap and go and find your file directly, leveled 02, and we want to override the 1.0. We want to make sure this is a value-based map as opposed to a color-based map. Same thing with the normals. We want to make sure we're not gammaing that automatically. Now, in Maya, we had a vray material called the bump material, which is right here. Now, you may not see this if you are in QuickShade view. Notice how some of our nodes disappeared out of the slate material editor when we invoked Active Shade with RT. Let's cancel out of here and close that. We have to be in regular production. Let's go ahead and stop that render as well to get those nodes back. So here we are with the vray bump material. And just like we had it in Maya, you're going to stack your base material into our bump base, like so. And then we're going to go ahead and take our additional bump map, which we've brought in over here to be in the bump. And our bump amount we'll set to about 25%. We have our base material as the skin. We're going to go ahead and assign to our alien bust. And then we can go ahead and render to check that the bump is adding on top of our normals map. And it looks like it certainly is. Crazy on the reflection here. It looks like our bump map is just a little too hot. I think we had 25% in Maya, but I think we're going to need a lot less here in Max. And there we go. We're getting a little bit of that skin texture coming in. Probably still a little too hot. You'll notice that if we look in our render history, there's a slight tendency to lose that shape from the normal map if we get too high on that. So let's do a much more mellow 1.5 on that bump, and that should give us a pretty good texture on the skin without really blowing out the normals. You could also accomplish the same without using the vray bump material by using 3ds Max's built-in normal and bump map, which is found in the maps rollout under the standard normal bump map. Allows you to stack a normal and an additional bump map as well. It'll give you a fairly similar result, although your bump amount will be slightly different than the amount that we've got here. Here, 1.5 will work, and if we go through 3ds Max's normal bump node, this additional bump would be about a 0.06. Now, you're going to want to invert this. You can do that quite easily by going to the output section and turning on invert, and we'll take a look at the comparison between the two to see how much of a difference we'll get in that skin. But by and large, we're getting a pretty nice little skin texture already on top of our skin material. And there we are. Inverting the map has done a little bit. It's given us a finer texture than this Orion has. You can feel free to use it as you wish. But by and large, this is how we do it in 3ds Max. Next week, we'll pick this up, do the hard coat shell, and also render in Elements. Have a wonderful week, and see you on the forums.